Hey guys, so this is Gajansky here, and today we're going to talk about carbohydrates and about what those things are. And we're going to start with taking a look at some things that we probably already know. When we think about carbohydrates, we usually think of, tasty, delicious stuff like cake here, or maybe even fruits that have it. Syrup, milk might come to mind, possibly. Basically, carbs come in two general varieties. There's the simple carbohydrates, and there are other ones that are more complex carbohydrates. So when we look at simple carbohydrates, there are some things that are pretty good, like there are fruits and milk and vegetables, which are good source of some carbs. But then we also have those things like cake and candy and the refined sugars and those things that we know probably would be better to stay away from instead of having too much of that. The other form of carbohydrates are complex carbohydrates, and we can see those in potatoes and the grains and pasta and things like that that we consume quite a bit. And those generally are the slightly better kinds of carbs for us to consume because they give us fiber and they basically are slow to break down the body, and that's a good thing for us. So we're going to take a look at just general functions. What do carbs do for us? Why do we eat them? And basically, the main reason is immediate energy. It's the fuel of life. It's what keeps us going all the time. And the main process that we look at is something called cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is simply this idea that we take those carbohydrates and we mostly are looking at glucose because glucose is the main sugar that powers life on Earth. And we run glucose through this process called cellular respiration. And you can see that in the picture down here where you start out with a bunch of glucose and you send it down into your cell. And your cell will run it through a couple of processes. There are sort of three main steps that happen to run that glucose through. And eventually what's going to happen is your body or your cells are going to produce a whole lot of this molecule called ATP. Now, ATP is really the molecule that runs all life that we know of on Earth. It is the universal energy molecule. It stands for adenosine triphosphate, and we'll be looking at that later. So that's the real main purpose of consuming carbohydrates. The second general function, take a look at these pictures. There's a nice little picture of a potato here, and this thing here is your liver. And sometimes when you don't really need all that energy right away, you're going to store it. So the other function is energy storage, and plants do it in one way. Plants are going to store the carbohydrate as something called starch, and in animals, we store it as something called glycogen. So it's a little bit different for plants and animals, but basically the idea is the same thing, that we take these individual units. So if you're a plant like a potato plant, for example, you take these individual units, and those individual units are actually glucose, which, this writing is going to be really terrible to read, but anyway, there it is. Whew, this is like the worst guy writing ever. All right, anyway, I think you get the idea. That's glucose. You'll link a whole bunch of them together and you form what's called starch. And starch kind of comes in a couple of forms, but it's all the same idea. The plant is socking it away for later when it might need it for growth. If you're an animal, then we don't make starch. We make the animal form of that, which is also made of the same unit as glucose. I'm not going to try to write that again, but those individual units of glucose all get stuck together, and we make these very, very long chains that are super highly branched, and we store them in a couple places, like in our livers and also in our muscles, and we keep that for later use when we need it as well. The third function is something that we don't really use much of as animals, or as humans at least, but some animals do, and certainly some insects in that, and plants do, but it's for structure. So in structural carbohydrates, they take very long chains of, guess what it is? Pretty much it's glucose. And they will take those long chains of glucose, Sometimes they're modified a little bit. They might be a slightly different form of glucose, but you can see in here all these little hexagon things. Those are all a form of glucose linked together in a slightly different form, and that is used in cell walls. Now, we normally think of cell walls in plants, but bacteria have them as well, slightly different form than plants. Fungi and algae also have cell walls, and they use this material that's made out of basically glucose. The other one is insects and crustaceans, like our good friend here, the lobster, and it's going to form an exoskeleton, so that's that tough outer part. So insects and crustaceans are hard on the outside and gooey on the inside. We're kind of the reverse of that. But they basically take these chains of glucose, modified glucose, put them together, and make this very tough material for their structure. Now, the carbohydrates we're going to look at come in a variety of forms. We're going to look at 3 different structures of them. The first one are what are called monosaccharides. Monosaccharides, as the name infers, mono meaning one, saccharide refers to sugar. So these are the single sugars. And if you look down here, I've got a little picture of a couple of examples. We've mentioned glucose before. There's also fructose, or as the British call it, fructose. There's galactose as well. And you'll notice that that sugar and glucose look really, really similar. They're pretty hard to tell apart unless you're very careful at what you're looking at. But there are also some other monosaccharides, such as ribose and the famous deoxyribose, which is found in DNA, which we'll take a look at at a future date. These are all the monosaccharides. So monosaccharides are single sugars. Their main function is for immediate energy. So when you really need to get going and produce a lot of ATP, that's what your cells are using right away. If you look at the general formula for all of these, they all look slightly different. They're all slightly different structures compared to each other. So if you look at glucose here compared to fructose, it's quite different from each other in structure. But they all have the same general formula, and it's this. It's basically 2 hydrogens for every 1 carbon and 1 oxygen. So they have this general formula of CH2ON, and an example of that would be C6H12O6, and this is a really common formula that you're going to get to know pretty well. It is the formula for glucose, it's the formula for fructose and some other sugars, but not all monosaccharides have that formula. So that's just one example of a monosaccharide